In the shadowed corridors of human ambition, where the weak are devoured by their own hesitations and the strong forge their destinies with calculated precision, there exists a path that few dare to walk. It is a path illuminated not by the gentle light of conventional wisdom, but by the harsh, unforgiving flame of Machiavellian truth. This is the story of transformation, not the gentle metamorphosis of the dreamer, but the violent reconstruction of the self through the deliberate destruction of weakness. The concept is deceptively simple yet profoundly revolutionary. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. In these words lies the essence of a philosophy that has shaped empires, toppled kingdoms, and elevated ordinary individuals to extraordinary heights of power and influence. Yet for all its historical significance, this principle remains one of the most misunderstood and underutilized tools in the modern arsenal of self-improvement. To understand the Machiavellian path to self-transformation, we must first acknowledge an uncomfortable truth about human nature. Weakness is not merely the absence of strength, it is an active force of destruction that operates from within, systematically dismantling our potential, sabotaging our progress, and delivering us, bound and helpless, into the hands of those who would exploit our vulnerabilities. The weak man does not simply fail to achieve greatness, he becomes the architect of his own downfall, constructing elaborate prisons of limitation and then wondering why he cannot escape. The traditional approaches to self-improvement often dance around this central reality, offering gentle encouragements and gradual modifications that, while well-intentioned, fail to address the fundamental issue that true transformation requires not the nurturing of weakness, but its complete and utter annihilation. The Machiavellian understands that there can be no coexistence between the strong and weak versions of oneself, one must consume the other entirely. This document presents a comprehensive exploration of this transformative philosophy, divided into three interconnected segments that build upon one another like the layers of a fortress. The first segment examines the anatomy of weakness, dissecting the various forms it takes and understanding how these manifestations operate to undermine our potential. The second segment delves into the systematic destruction of these weak elements, providing practical strategies and psychological frameworks for their elimination. The third and final segment focuses on the construction of strength, the forging of an unassailable self that stands immune to the attacks and manipulations of others. But, be warned, this is not a path for the faint of heart. The Machiavellian transformation demands a level of brutal self-honesty that many find unbearable. It requires the willingness to look upon one's own weaknesses without the comforting filters of self-deception, to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about one's character and capabilities, and to undertake the sometimes painful process of systematic self-reconstruction. Those who embark upon this journey must be prepared to sacrifice cherished illusions, comfortable patterns of behavior, and the familiar refuge of victimhood in exchange for something far more valuable, true personal sovereignty. Part 1: The Anatomy of Weakness. Understanding the enemy within. The first and, perhaps most crucial step in the Machiavellian transformation is developing a comprehensive understanding of weakness in all its forms. Weakness is not a single entity but, rather, a complex ecosystem of interrelated vulnerabilities, each feeding off and reinforcing the others in an endless cycle of limitation and self-sabotage. To destroy this enemy effectively, one must first map its territories, understand its tactics, and identify its supply lines. The most insidious characteristic of weakness is its ability to masquerade as virtue. Society, in its well-meaning but ultimately misguided attempts to promote harmony and equality, has elevated many forms of weakness to the status of moral imperatives. We are taught to view excessive empathy as compassion, indecision as thoughtfulness, and the inability to assert our will as humility. This cultural programming creates a double barrier to transformation. Not only must we overcome our weaknesses, but we must first recognize them as weaknesses rather than virtues. Consider the phenomenon of emotional reactivity, perhaps one of the most common and destructive forms of weakness in the modern world. The emotionally reactive individual is essentially a puppet dancing to the strings pulled by external circumstances and other people's behaviors. When someone criticizes them, they become defensive. When faced with conflict, they either explode in anger or retreat into sullen resentment. When confronted with uncertainty, they spiral into anxiety and paralysis. This person has abdicated their sovereignty over their own emotional state, handing control to anyone and everyone who chooses to exercise it. Yet our culture often celebrates emotional reactivity under the guise of authenticity or being true to one's feelings. We are told that suppressing emotional reactions is unhealthy, that we should let it all out, and that controlling our emotions somehow makes us less human. This is precisely the kind of thinking that keeps individuals trapped in cycles of weakness, forever at the mercy of external forces and internal impulses they cannot control. The Machiavellian understands that emotions, while natural and potentially useful, must never be allowed to dictate behavior or decision-making. Emotions are data points, nothing more information about our internal state that can inform our choices but should never control them. The strong individual experiences emotions just as intensely as the weak, but maintains complete sovereignty over their expression and influence on behavior. Another pervasive form of weakness is the need for external validation. This manifests in countless ways: the desperate pursuit of likes and comments on social media, the inability to make decisions without consensus, the constant seeking of approval from authority figures, family members, or peers. The validation-seeking individual has externalized their sense of self-worth, making their very identity dependent upon the opinions and approval of others. This dependency creates a fundamental vulnerability that others can and will exploit. The person who needs validation becomes predictable and manipulable, always willing to compromise their own interests and values in exchange for acceptance and approval. They become what the Machiavellian would recognize as a natural subordinate, someone who, through their own weakness, invites domination. The addiction to comfort represents another significant category of weakness. Modern society has created an unprecedented level of physical comfort and convenience, and many individuals have become so accustomed to ease that they have lost the ability to tolerate discomfort of any kind. This weakness manifests not only in physical terms, the inability to endure hunger, cold, physical exertion, or pain, but also in psychological and emotional terms. The comfort-addicted individual avoids difficult conversations, challenging situations, and any form of stress or uncertainty. They choose the familiar over the optimal, the easy over the necessary, and the comfortable over the transformative. This attachment to comfort creates a prison of limitation, preventing growth, adaptation, and the development of resilience. Perhaps even more damaging is the weakness of self-deception. Human beings possess a remarkable capacity for rationalization, able to construct elaborate justifications for their failures, limitations, and poor decisions. The weak individual uses this capacity not as a tool for temporary psychological protection during genuine crises, but as a permanent defense mechanism against reality itself. Self-deception manifests in numerous forms: the perpetual victim who explains every failure as the result of external circumstances beyond their control, the dreamer who substitutes fantasy for action, the procrastinator who always has compelling reasons for delay, and the excuse maker who can rationalize any failure or limitation. These individuals have essentially declared war on reality, choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The Machiavellian recognizes self-deception as perhaps the most dangerous form of weakness because it prevents accurate self-assessment and realistic planning. How can one improve what one refuses to acknowledge? How can one solve problems that one pretends do not exist? The self-deceiving individual becomes trapped in cycles of repeated failure because they cannot accurately identify the true causes of their difficulties. Social weakness represents another critical vulnerability. Many individuals have developed dependencies on social structures, relationships, and group dynamics that leave them unable to function effectively as independent agents. They cannot be alone, cannot make decisions without consensus, cannot take action without support, and cannot maintain their identity outside of their social roles and relationships. This social dependency creates multiple points of vulnerability. Others can control them through social pressure, isolation, or the threat of exclusion. Their self-concept becomes so intertwined with their social identity that any disruption in their relationships or social status becomes a crisis of identity. They become unable to pursue goals or make decisions that might conflict with social expectations, even when such actions would serve their long-term interests. The weakness of inconsistency plagues many who attempt self-improvement. They begin projects with enthusiasm but abandon them when the initial excitement fades. They make commitments but fail to honor them when keeping them becomes inconvenient. They set standards for themselves but lower them whenever adherence becomes challenging. This pattern of inconsistency destroys credibility, both with others and, more importantly, with oneself. the inconsistent individual cannot be trusted, even by themselves. Their word becomes meaningless, their commitments worthless, and their goals little more than temporary fantasies. This erosion of self-trust creates a profound weakness because it makes sustained effort toward any meaningful goal impossible. Mental laziness represents a particularly insidious form of weakness in our information-rich age. The mentally lazy individual seeks simple answers to complex questions, accepts easy explanations for difficult problems, and avoids the rigorous thinking required for genuine understanding and effective problem-solving. They become consumers of other people's thoughts rather than producers of their own insights. This weakness manifests in the uncritical acceptance of popular opinions, the preference for entertainment over education, the avoidance of challenging intellectual material, and the substitution of slogans and catchphrases for genuine analysis. The mentally lazy individual becomes predictable and manipulable because they have outsourced their thinking to others. The anatomy of weakness also includes what might be called temporal weakness, the inability to properly orient oneself in time. This manifests as excessive focus on the past, living in regret, nostalgia, or resentment, obsession with the present, seeking immediate gratification at the expense of long-term benefit, or anxiety about the future, paralysis in the face of uncertainty or potential negative outcomes. The temporally weak individual cannot effectively balance immediate needs with long-term goals, cannot learn from the past without being trapped by it, and cannot prepare for the future without being paralyzed by anxiety. They become reactive rather than proactive, responsive rather than strategic, and victims of time rather than masters of it. Understanding these various forms of weakness is crucial because they rarely exist in isolation. Instead, they form interconnected webs of limitation, each weakness reinforcing and enabling the others. The emotionally reactive individual often seeks external validation to soothe their emotional volatility. The comfort-addicted person frequently engages in self-deception to justify their avoidance of challenge. The socially dependent individual may develop mental laziness by accepting group consensus rather than thinking independently. This interconnected nature of weakness explains why partial solutions often fail. Addressing one form of weakness while ignoring others frequently leads to the remaining weaknesses adapting and growing stronger to compensate. True transformation requires a systematic approach that identifies and eliminates weakness in all its forms. The Machiavellian approach to weakness is fundamentally different from conventional self-help methodologies. Rather than trying to manage, minimize, or work around weaknesses, the Machiavellian seeks their complete destruction. This is not a matter of suppression or control, but of actual elimination, the systematic removal of weak elements from one's character and behavior patterns. This approach recognizes that weakness and strength cannot coexist peacefully within the same individual. They are fundamentally opposed forces, and any attempt to balance or harmonize them will result in the eventual victory of weakness. The weak elements of personality will constantly undermine and sabotage the strong elements, creating internal conflict, inconsistency, and ultimate failure. The process of identifying weakness within oneself requires a level of brutal honesty that many find unbearable. It demands the temporary suspension of ego protection mechanisms, the willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, and the courage to face the gap between one's self-image and reality. This process is not comfortable, but it is absolutely necessary for genuine transformation. One effective method for weakness identification is what might be called outcome analysis. Rather than focusing on intentions, efforts, or explanations, this approach examines actual results and works backward to identify the weak elements that produce them. If one consistently fails to achieve their stated goals, weakness is present and operating. If one finds themselves repeatedly in disadvantageous positions, weakness has created vulnerability. If one's life lacks the power, influence, and achievement they desire, weakness has prevented their attainment. This analysis must be conducted with scientific detachment, treating oneself as a subject of study rather than an object of protection. The goal is not self-condemnation but accurate diagnosis. A physician does not judge a patient for having a disease, they simply identify it accurately so that appropriate treatment can be prescribed. Similarly, the individual seeking transformation must diagnose their weaknesses without judgment but with complete honesty. The identification process should also include an examination of patterns over time. Isolated incidents of weakness might be dismissed as anomalies or temporary lapses, but patterns reveal structural problems that require systematic solutions. The individual who repeatedly finds themselves in similar negative situations, making similar poor decisions, or experiencing similar failures is revealing the presence of underlying weaknesses that require attention. External feedback, when properly filtered and interpreted, can also provide valuable data for weakness identification. The opinions of others should never be accepted uncritically, but patterns in how others perceive and treat us can reveal vulnerabilities we might not recognize ourselves. If others consistently take advantage of us in similar ways, we are displaying predictable weaknesses that invite exploitation. If we repeatedly find ourselves in subordinate positions when we intended to be equals or superiors, we are manifesting weaknesses that undermine our power and influence. The ultimate goal of this analysis is not self-flagellation but strategic understanding. Once weaknesses are accurately identified and understood, they can be systematically eliminated through the application of Machiavellian principles and practices. The man who knows his weaknesses intimately has taken the first and most crucial step toward their destruction and toward the forging of his own invincible strength. Part 2: The Systematic Destruction of Weakness. Forging through fire. Having thoroughly mapped the territories of weakness, we now turn to the far more challenging and dangerous work of their complete annihilation. The destruction of weakness is not a gentle process of gradual improvement or incremental change, it is a violent rupture with the past, a deliberate shattering of familiar patterns, and a ruthless elimination of everything that has previously limited your potential. This is the forge in which the strongest version of yourself will be born, but, like all forges, it operates through the application of intense heat, pressure, and the systematic removal of impurities. The Machiavellian approach to destroying weakness operates on several fundamental principles that distinguish it from conventional self-improvement methodologies. First, it recognizes that weakness must be completely eliminated rather than managed or minimized. Partial destruction of weakness is not merely ineffective, it is counterproductive, as surviving weak elements will adapt, strengthen, and eventually reconquer territory they have temporarily lost. Second, the process must be systematic and comprehensive, addressing the interconnected web of weaknesses rather than focusing on isolated symptoms. Third, the destruction must be permanent, requiring the construction of new behavioral patterns and psychological structures that make the return of old weaknesses impossible. The first phase of weakness destruction involves what might be termed environmental warfare, the systematic elimination of external factors that enable, support, or trigger weak behaviors. Most individuals attempting self-improvement focus exclusively on internal changes while leaving their environment unchanged. This approach is doomed to failure because environmental factors exert constant pressure toward the maintenance of existing patterns. Consider the individual seeking to eliminate the weakness of emotional reactivity. If they continue to surround themselves with people who trigger emotional responses, consume media that promotes emotional volatility, and maintain lifestyle patterns that increase stress and reduce emotional regulation, their internal efforts at change will be constantly undermined by external pressures. The environment must be restructured to support the new, stronger patterns of behavior rather than the old, weak ones. This environmental restructuring often requires difficult decisions and temporary social isolation. The weak individual has typically surrounded themselves with people who enable their weakness, friends who validate their victim mentality, family members who excuse their failures, colleagues who accommodate their limitations, and romantic partners who benefit from their dependency. Eliminating weakness often requires the temporary or permanent elimination of these relationships. This is where the Machiavellian approach reveals its ruthless practicality. While conventional wisdom suggests that we should maintain relationships for their own sake, the Machiavellian recognizes that relationships, like all other elements of life, must serve our strategic purposes or be eliminated. People who consistently enable our weakness are not truly friends, they are obstacles to our development who must be removed if genuine transformation is to occur. The environmental warfare extends beyond social relationships to include physical environment, information diet, and daily routines. The physical spaces we inhabit should reinforce strength rather than enable weakness. Comfort-reducing modifications to living spaces can help eliminate the weakness of comfort addiction. The removal of distracting entertainment and the introduction of challenging intellectual material can combat mental laziness. The establishment of routines that require discipline and consistency can help destroy patterns of self-indulgence and instant gratification. The information diet requires particular attention in our current media-saturated environment. The weak individual typically consumes information that reinforces their weakness, victim narratives that justify their failures, entertainment that provides escape from reality, and social media content that feeds their need for external validation. This information diet must be completely restructured to support strength development rather than weakness maintenance. The second phase of weakness destruction involves what we might call controlled stress application, the deliberate introduction of challenges and difficulties that force the development of strength. Weakness thrives in environments of comfort and predictability. It withers under pressure and dies when forced to perform beyond its capabilities. The systematic application of appropriately calibrated stress becomes a weapon for weakness destruction. This stress application must be strategic rather than random. The goal is not to create overwhelming trauma that produces breakdown, but to introduce manageable challenges that force adaptation and growth. The individual seeking to eliminate emotional reactivity might deliberately expose themselves to criticism and conflict in controlled environments where they can practice new response patterns. The person combating social dependency might undertake solo activities and make independent decisions that gradually build confidence in their individual capabilities. The key to effective stress application is progressive overload, the same principle used in physical fitness training. Just as muscles grow stronger when forced to work against progressively greater resistance, psychological weaknesses are eliminated when consistently challenged by appropriately escalating demands. The comfort-addicted individual might begin with minor discomforts, cold showers, physical exercise, or brief periods of hunger before progressing to more significant challenges that further erode the attachment to ease and convenience. This process requires careful calibration. Insufficient stress will not produce the necessary adaptations, while excessive stress may produce breakdown rather than breakthrough. The skilled practitioner of weakness destruction learns to operate in what might be called the growth zone, that space between comfortable familiarity and overwhelming challenge where real transformation becomes possible. The third phase involves what can be termed pattern interruption and replacement. Weakness operates through predictable patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior that have become automated through repetition. These patterns function like software programs running in the background of consciousness, automatically producing weak responses to familiar triggers. Destroying weakness requires not only the interruption of these patterns but their complete replacement with stronger alternatives. Pattern interruption begins with the development of acute self-awareness. The individual must learn to recognize the early warning signs of weak behavior patterns before they fully activate. This might involve identifying physical sensations, emotional states, thought patterns, or environmental triggers that typically precede weak responses. The earlier in the pattern these warning signs can be detected, the more effectively the pattern can be interrupted. The interruption itself must be immediate and decisive. Half-hearted attempts at pattern interruption often result in the pattern completing itself while the individual watches helplessly. Effective interruption requires what might be called violent self-intervention, an immediate and complete halt to the weak pattern combined with the immediate implementation of a stronger alternative. For the emotionally reactive individual, this might mean the instant implementation of a cooling-off protocol the moment emotional activation is detected, physical removal from the triggering situation, engagement in a predetermined calming activity, or the execution of a specific sequence of actions designed to restore emotional equilibrium. The key is that these alternative responses must be predetermined, practiced, and immediately available for implementation. Pattern replacement involves the systematic installation of new behavioral programs to fill the void left by eliminated weak patterns. Nature abhors a vacuum, and psychological nature is no different. Weak patterns cannot simply be removed, they must be replaced with stronger alternatives that serve the same psychological functions more effectively. This replacement process requires the development of what might be called strength rituals, predetermined sequences of thoughts and actions that produce the desired stronger outcomes. These rituals must be practiced until they become as automatic as the weak patterns they replace. The individual who has eliminated victim thinking might install a responsibility ritual that immediately redirects attention from blame and complaint toward problem solving and action taking. The person who has destroyed people-pleasing patterns might install an authentic assertion ritual that allows them to express their true thoughts and preferences without anxiety or guilt. The fourth phase of weakness destruction involves what can be termed consequence restructuring, the systematic modification of the reward and punishment systems that maintain weak behaviors. Weakness persists because it provides some form of immediate benefit or avoids some form of immediate discomfort, even when it produces long-term negative consequences. Destroying weakness requires making it immediately painful and expensive while making strength immediately rewarding and beneficial. This restructuring often requires the establishment of artificial consequences when natural ones are delayed or insufficient. The procrastinator might establish a system of financial penalties for missed deadlines. The person struggling with consistency might create public accountability systems that make failures socially embarrassing. The individual combating comfort addiction might establish rewards for completing uncomfortable challenges. The key insight here is that consequences shape behavior more powerfully than intentions or willpower. By carefully engineering the consequence structure of their choices, the individual can make weak behaviors virtually impossible to maintain while making strong behaviors increasingly attractive and automatic. The fifth and, perhaps most crucial phase involves what we might call identity restructuring, the systematic modification of self-concept to align with strength rather than weakness. Most individuals maintain weak behaviors because they have constructed identities around their weaknesses. They see themselves as sensitive people, emotional reactivity, caring individuals, people-pleasing, or victims of circumstance, external locus of control. These weak identities must be completely dismantled and replaced with identities based on strength and capability. This process goes beyond positive thinking or affirmations. It requires the systematic accumulation of evidence that supports the new, stronger identity while eliminating evidence that supports the old, weak one. This evidence accumulation occurs through what might be called strength demonstrations, deliberate actions taken specifically to prove to oneself that the old weak identity is no longer accurate. The former people-pleaser must demonstrate their ability to say no and prioritize their own interests. The former victim must demonstrate their ability to take responsibility and create positive change. The former comfort addict must demonstrate their ability to thrive in discomfort and uncertainty. These demonstrations must be significant enough to create genuine belief in the new identity. Minor changes or token gestures will not overcome years of contrary evidence and established self-concept. The demonstrations must be substantial, visible, and undeniable actions that force even the most skeptical part of the psyche to acknowledge that fundamental change has occurred. The process of identity restructuring also involves what might be called historical reframing, the systematic reinterpretation of past events and experiences to support the new identity rather than the old one. The victim identity is maintained through a continuous narrative that emphasizes helplessness and external control. The strong identity requires a different narrative that emphasizes agency, capability, and the ability to influence outcomes. This reframing does not involve self-deception or denial of difficult experiences. Instead, it involves focusing on evidence of resilience, adaptation, and strength that may have been overlooked or minimized in the original weak interpretation of events. The goal is to construct an accurate but strength-focused narrative that supports the new identity and worldview. The systematic destruction of weakness is not a comfortable process. It requires the willingness to sacrifice familiar patterns, comfortable relationships, and cherished self-concepts in pursuit of something greater. It demands a level of self-discipline and commitment that many find daunting. But, for those who persist through the destruction phase, the rewards are transformational. The individual who has successfully eliminated weakness finds themselves in possession of psychological resources they never knew they had. They discover resilience they didn't know existed, capabilities they had never accessed, and a level of personal power that transforms their relationship with the world. They become what the Machiavellian recognizes as truly dangerous, not because they seek to harm others, but because they can no longer be harmed by others. This transformation creates what we might call anti-fragility, not merely the ability to withstand attack and adversity, but the ability to grow stronger through challenge and opposition. The individual who has destroyed their weakness and forged their strength welcomes rather than fears difficulty because they have learned that pressure creates diamonds and fire refines gold. The completion of the destruction phase marks the transition from the old, weak self to something entirely new. But destruction alone is not sufficient. The third and final phase involves the systematic construction of an invincible character, the positive creation of strength that makes future weakness impossible and establishes permanent sovereignty over one's life and circumstances. Part 3: The construction of invincible strength. Building the fortress. The destruction of weakness, while necessary, is only half of the Machiavellian transformation. Destruction creates a void, an empty space where old patterns and limitations once resided. This void must be filled deliberately and systematically, not with rebuilt versions of what was destroyed, but with something entirely new, structures of strength so robust and comprehensive that they make the return of weakness impossible. This is the phase of construction, where the individual moves from being merely not weak to being genuinely strong, from avoiding defeat to ensuring victory, from surviving challenges to conquering them. The construction of invincible strength operates on principles fundamentally different from those governing destruction. Where destruction is violent and sudden, construction is methodical and patient. Where destruction eliminates what should not exist, construction builds what must exist. Where destruction is primarily reactive, responding to identified weaknesses, construction is proactive, creating capabilities and resources that extend far beyond merely compensating for former limitations. The architectural metaphor is particularly appropriate here because genuine strength, like a well-designed fortress, must be built according to strategic principles that account for every potential point of attack or failure. The strong individual is not someone who has overcome their weaknesses, they are someone who has constructed their character so comprehensively that weakness cannot find purchase or foothold anywhere in their psychological architecture. The foundation of this construction lies in what might be called philosophical sovereignty, the development of a worldview and value system that is internally generated, logically consistent, and immune to external manipulation or contradiction. Most individuals operate from borrowed philosophies, inherited value systems, and socially conditioned beliefs that they have never subjected to rigorous examination. This philosophical dependency creates fundamental vulnerability because others can control their behavior by manipulating their beliefs and values. The construction of philosophical sovereignty begins with the systematic examination and reconstruction of one's core beliefs about reality, human nature, success, failure, right, wrong, and the nature of power itself. This process requires the temporary suspension of all inherited beliefs and the careful reconstruction of a worldview based on direct observation, logical analysis, and strategic utility rather than social acceptability or emotional comfort. This philosophical reconstruction typically involves the acceptance of several uncomfortable truths about the nature of reality that most people prefer to avoid. The recognition that the world operates according to power dynamics rather than fairness or justice. The understanding that individual responsibility is absolute and that external circumstances, while influential, cannot excuse personal failure or limitation. The acknowledgement that human beings are fundamentally self-interested and that expecting altruism or sacrifice from others is both naive and strategically foolish. These philosophical foundations, while initially disturbing to those accustomed to more comforting worldviews, provide unshakable bedrock for the construction of strength. When one's worldview accurately reflects reality rather than wishful thinking, decisions can be made based on what actually works rather than what should theoretically work. When one's values are internally generated rather than externally imposed, they cannot be used as weapons of manipulation by others. The second layer of construction involves what we might term strategic thinking architecture, the development of systematic approaches to decision-making, problem-solving, and goal achievement that operate automatically and efficiently in any situation. Weak individuals typically approach problems reactively, emotionally, and inconsistently. Strong individuals develop standardized thinking processes that produce optimal outcomes regardless of external circumstances or internal emotional states. This strategic architecture includes several key components. First, the development of multiple horizon thinking, the ability to simultaneously consider short-term tactics, medium-term strategies, and long-term consequences in every decision. Weak individuals focus almost exclusively on immediate concerns and consequences. Strong individuals consider the implications of their choices across multiple timeframes and optimize for long-term advantage even when this requires short-term sacrifice. Second, the installation of systematic risk assessment capabilities. Every decision involves trade-offs and potential negative consequences. Strong individuals develop the ability to accurately assess and prepare for these risks rather than ignoring them or hoping they won't materialize. This involves not only identifying what could go wrong but developing contingency plans and exit strategies that minimize potential damage. Third, the construction of resource optimization thinking, the automatic consideration of how any action or decision affects the individual's strategic resources of time, energy, money, relationships, and reputation. Weak individuals often spend these resources carelessly or allow others to waste them. Strong individuals become highly conscious of their resource expenditure and ensure that every significant action produces a positive return on investment. The third layer of construction focuses on what might be called emotional architecture, the development of sophisticated emotional regulation capabilities that allow for optimal performance under any circumstances. This goes far beyond the simple suppression or control of emotions to include the strategic utilization of emotional states for maximum advantage. Emotional architecture begins with the recognition that emotions, while natural and potentially useful, must never be allowed to drive decision-making or behavior. Emotions provide valuable information about internal states and external circumstances, but they are poor guides for action. The construction of strength requires the development of systems that can process emotional information while maintaining rational decision-making capabilities. This involves several specific capabilities. First, emotional recognition and classification, the ability to accurately identify emotional states as they arise and understand their potential causes and implications. Second, emotional regulation, the ability to modulate emotional intensity and duration to match strategic requirements rather than simply experiencing whatever emotions arise naturally. Third, emotional utilization, the ability to generate and employ specific emotional states when they serve strategic purposes. The strong individual learns to use emotions as tools rather than being used by them. Anger can be channeled into determination and focused effort. Fear can be transformed into caution and thorough preparation. Excitement can be modulated to maintain focus and prevent overcommitment. Sadness can be processed efficiently and converted into wisdom and resilience. This emotional architecture also includes the development of what might be termed emotional immunity, the ability to remain unaffected by others' emotional states and manipulations. Weak individuals typically mirror the emotions of those around them and can be controlled through emotional contagion. Strong individuals maintain their emotional equilibrium regardless of external emotional pressures. The fourth layer involves the construction of what we might call social power architecture, sophisticated capabilities for understanding, influencing, and controlling social dynamics and relationships. Human beings are inherently social creatures, and even the most independent individual must operate within social contexts. Strength requires not the avoidance of social interaction but the mastery of it. Social power architecture begins with the development of accurate social perception, the ability to quickly and accurately assess the motivations, capabilities, weaknesses, and intentions of others. This involves learning to read subtle cues in body language, voice tone, word choice, and behavioral patterns that reveal information people are not consciously communicating. This perceptual accuracy extends to understanding social hierarchies and power dynamics. Every social situation involves complex networks of influence, authority, alliance, and opposition. Strong individuals learn to map these dynamics quickly and position themselves advantageously within them. They understand who has real power versus who has apparent authority, who makes actual decisions versus who appears to make them, and how influence flows through social networks. The construction of social power also involves developing sophisticated communication capabilities. This includes not only the ability to express ideas clearly and persuasively but the strategic use of communication to achieve specific objectives. Strong individuals learn when to speak and when to listen, when to reveal information and when to conceal it, when to be direct and when to be subtle. Perhaps most importantly, social power architecture includes the development of what might be called relationship optimization, the ability to structure and manage relationships to serve strategic purposes while maintaining the appearance of naturalness and spontaneity. This does not mean treating people as mere tools, but rather ensuring that relationships are mutually beneficial and strategically sound rather than emotionally driven or socially conventional. The fifth layer of construction focuses on resource architecture, the systematic development and management of all forms of power and capability. Strength is not merely a matter of psychological development but requires the accumulation and strategic deployment of tangible resources that provide real-world power and influence. Financial architecture represents one crucial component of resource development. Money is not merely a means of purchasing goods and services but a form of stored power that provides options, security, and influence. The construction of strength requires the systematic development of financial resources through income optimization, expense minimization, strategic investment, and the creation of multiple income streams that reduce dependency on any single source. Knowledge architecture represents another critical component. In our information-based economy, specialized knowledge and skills provide tremendous leverage and power. Strong individuals systematically develop expertise in areas that are valuable, scarce, and difficult to replicate. They also cultivate broad general knowledge that allows them to understand and operate effectively in multiple domains. Network architecture involves the systematic development of relationships with individuals who possess complementary skills, resources, and influence. This is not about using people but about creating mutually beneficial relationships that enhance everyone's capabilities. Strong individuals understand that isolation is weakness and that carefully cultivated networks multiply individual power exponentially. Physical architecture, while often overlooked in discussions of personal development, provides the foundation for all other forms of strength. Physical health, fitness, and capability directly impact energy levels, mental clarity, emotional resilience, and social presence. The construction of strength requires attention to nutrition, exercise, sleep, and other factors that optimize physical performance. The sixth layer involves what might be termed systematic advantage creation, the development of approaches to life that consistently produce superior outcomes across multiple domains. This goes beyond simple goal achievement to include the creation of systems and processes that generate ongoing advantages and compound over time. Systematic advantage creation begins with the recognition that success is not primarily about achieving specific goals but about developing systems that produce ongoing positive results. Goals are finite, systems are infinite. The individual who develops superior systems for learning, networking, financial management, health maintenance, and skill development will consistently outperform those who focus only on achieving specific objectives. This systematic approach also involves the creation of what might be called positive feedback loops, systems where success in one area enhances performance in others, creating accelerating returns over time. Physical fitness enhances mental performance, which improves work performance, which increases financial resources, which provides more options for fitness and health optimization, creating an upward spiral of improvement. The construction of systematic advantages also requires the development of what we might call metaskills, capabilities that enhance the development of other capabilities. Learning how to learn efficiently, thinking how to think more effectively, and systematic approaches to skill acquisition provide leverage that multiplies the return on investment in other areas of development. The seventh and final layer of construction involves what might be termed invulnerability architecture, the development of systems and capabilities that make it impossible for others to harm, manipulate, or control the individual. This represents the ultimate expression of Machiavellian strength, not merely the ability to compete effectively but the creation of a position so strong that competition becomes irrelevant. Invulnerability architecture operates on multiple levels. Financial invulnerability involves the development of resources sufficient to maintain independence regardless of external economic conditions or the actions of employers, clients, or partners. Social invulnerability involves the cultivation of a reputation and network so strong that attempts at social destruction become counterproductive for the attacker. Psychological invulnerability involves the development of internal resources so robust that external criticism, manipulation, or attack cannot produce meaningful damage. This invulnerability is not about isolation or defensiveness but about strength so comprehensive that attacks become irrelevant. The financially invulnerable individual does not fear economic pressure because they have multiple sources of income and substantial reserves. The socially invulnerable individual does not fear reputation attacks because their actual capabilities and achievements speak louder than any criticism. The psychologically invulnerable individual does not fear manipulation because they have developed internal resources that provide complete emotional and intellectual independence. The construction of invincible strength is a process that typically requires years of sustained effort and development. Unlike the destruction of weakness, which can often be accomplished relatively quickly through decisive action, the construction of strength requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to invest in long-term development even when immediate results are not apparent. However, the results of this construction process are transformational. The individual who has successfully built these layers of strength finds themselves in possession of capabilities they had never imagined possible. They discover that they can handle situations that would have overwhelmed them in the past, achieve goals that previously seemed impossible, and influence outcomes that they had previously accepted as beyond their control. Most importantly, they discover the truth of the principle that began this exploration: the man who destroys his weak self and constructs invincible strength can never be destroyed by others. Not because no one will try. In fact, strength often attracts attacks from those who are threatened by capability and success, but because the attacks cannot find purchase on a character and capability structure that has been systematically designed to repel them. This is the ultimate Machiavellian achievement, not the mere accumulation of power over others, but the development of such complete self-mastery that external power becomes largely irrelevant. The truly strong individual needs nothing from others that they cannot provide for themselves, fears nothing from others because they have eliminated all vulnerabilities, and therefore operates from a position of absolute freedom and sovereignty. This freedom is not license for arbitrary behavior or cruelty to others, but rather the foundation for ethical action based on choice rather than compulsion. The weak individual who behaves morally does so from fear of consequences or need for approval. The strong individual who behaves morally does so from genuine choice and philosophical commitment. Paradoxically, the development of the power to harm others often results in the choice not to exercise that power, because the strong individual has transcended the need to dominate others and can afford to be generous and principled. The Machiavellian path to transformation is not for everyone. It requires a level of commitment, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice comfortable illusions that many find prohibitive. It demands the courage to face uncomfortable truths about oneself and the world, the persistence to continue development even when progress seems slow, and the wisdom to construct strength responsibly and ethically. But, for those who complete this journey, the rewards are beyond measurement. They discover capabilities they never knew they possessed, achieve outcomes they never thought possible, and experience a level of personal freedom and sovereignty that transforms every aspect of their existence. They become living proof of the principle that began this exploration, that the man who destroys his weak self and forges invincible strength can never be destroyed by others, because he has become a force of nature unto himself. In the end, the Machiavellian transformation is not about becoming someone else but about becoming who you truly are when all limitations, fears, and weaknesses have been stripped away. It is about discovering the diamond of your essential strength that has always existed beneath the accumulated sediment of conditioning, compromise, and comfortable limitation. The path is difficult, but the destination to true personal sovereignty and invincible strength justifies every sacrifice required to reach it. The journey from weakness to strength is not a destination but a transformation of being itself. Those who undertake this path discover that they do not merely acquire new capabilities, they become new people entirely, operating from fundamentally different principles and possessing resources they never knew existed. This is the true promise of the Machiavellian path, not just success in conventional terms, but the reconstruction of the self into something genuinely powerful, genuinely free, and genuinely unassailable.